Garry Momber. We've already heard from Garry, but he was talking more about the engagement side of things, whereas now he's going to talk about how the longue durée has been used to assess the SARCC pilots and how it can help us plan future ones more effectively. So over to you, Garry.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. Luckily, I'm 5 minutes early today. 2 days ago, I did talk about engagement, but the presentation, the session we had was a lot about engagement with the Discovery Bus tour and also the visualization tool. But I also gave you a bunch of context there, which is probably over and above what I should have done, and I did it rather quickly. Today, I'm going to dig back into some of that context, because I needed to present the context really to justify all these outreach activities we did. But today I'm going to just dig back into some of that context to just explain a bit about the Maritime Atlas, at which we generated for the word package 1, and also just to see how we took that data and how we analysed that data. Quite briefly, hopefully. So, as part of the talk, we'll be looking at why is long-term coastal change relevant? What data can we use to help understand coastal change, which will be going back through the data I described on Tuesday, and then looking at how we assess the data and we validate the data sets. And I'll finish with the contribution, how it contributes to spatial planning as part of the WP1 outputs. So, why is long-term coastal change relevant? Well, I did have a few slides to describe this, but really we're all pretty well informed here. And we know why it's relevant. We've been talking about it for the last 2 days. And effectively, the land is falling into the sea. So I don't need to dwell on that. But this picture is quite interesting because it does show how we can use some archaeology that we can fix the positions of that when it was built, and we can relate that to the receding coastline. And in the distance, you see lots of groins, nicely protecting the landscape, but holding back the sediment. So that poor chap's about to fall into the sea. So when we look at the data, what data can we use to understand coastal change? So we've got paleoenvironmental data in archaeology, which I have outlined briefly. We can look at art, then there's maps and charts, and then there's historical documents and photographs. So I'll start by returning to the Western Solent, because this is such a wonderful area that has a nice sort of chronology of archaeology and paleoenvironmental material, because that was our first data sets we're looking at. I did flip through this one quickly on Tuesday, but I just wanted to point out here that the Western Solent, just like the North Sea, was once a valley, large valley, and then it became an estuary, and it filled up with sediment. And then ultimately, the Isle of Wight separated from the mainland. This is automatically flipping. The Isle of Wight separated from mainland Britain in the same way that Great Britain separated from the continent, and it did again a few years ago. But what we then had was the sediments that were left behind, as they are in the North Sea. The sediments that are left behind do tell the story of that ongoing process of separation. So just going back into the Solent, into this Bolton Cliff, one of my favourite sites that we've used quite a lot. This is a section through the site, and you can see on the left here a schematic, and it shows the sort of that's the old paleo surface, that's the bottom of the valley, and then you had the sediments build up on top, and then you had sort of other sea levels, still stands, etc., and other organic growth. And then there's a diver in the middle that's paralleling this section, and then in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see root systems for an oak tree that's 8,000 years old, 8,500 years old, that's part of that ancient land surface. And importantly, as you travel up that sequence, you're traveling through time. And all the way through that sequence, it's got a long chronology that's explaining how the sea level has changed, how the environment's changed, where the sediments came from, etc., and how they're built up. And you can get to that. It's like one big section when you jump down in the Solent. So when I show you the images, that image of the landscape, you see the landscape on the top on the beach, then below it you've got that cliff, and then at the bottom you've got the platform. So you've got the nice platform here with the trees at the bottom, which that contains lots of archaeological material and paleoenvironmental material. Chronologically, you go up the cliff into the beach, and of course across to the intertidal zone. So that's a very long temporal sequence that can be analysed to really understand how the climate has changed and how it's adapted, and also how humans have adapted. So the sort of questions we ask of this landscape have been broken down so that we can get some form of score and we can rate the value of some of these the places. And that's what I mentioned before about having a score, trying to quantify the significance of these sites. And once you can quantify them, you can turn around to coastal managers and engineers and say, this particular site's good because it's got this high score, etc. And this is a process that we've been applying to all the different data sets. So here we look at sea level change. What can it tell us about sea level change? A nice long sequence, that's great. So it's got a maximum score of 3. Does it tell us about environmental change? Yes, as I've just described, maximum of 3. And temporal continuity, have we got a long continual stream of information? Again, the top score. And then we got some some describing elements to what sort of site it is, whether it's eroding away, is it still there, is it gone, is it accessible, and the coastal context, which is information that we can look at collectively when we want to query some of these results. So this has got a top score, well, it's 9, which is then turned into a percentage when we look at all the other archaeological and paleoenvironmental evidence. And of course, I showed you the intertidal zones, still very relevant, sort of things that we probably find around the sort of or North Sea coasts, if the sediments are removed. On the left, you've got here, that's an old Roman causeway, a couple of thousand years old. And then on the right-hand side, where you've got the scale, that sort of Bronze Age structure, about 3,200 years old. So again, as you're going down the beach, you're sort of going back in time, and it gives you that sort of chronology of change using the archaeology, which is, you can date the archaeology, of course. You've got dendrochronology, carbon-14, so you can date it, so you can get some high-resolution information about that coastline, how it formed, and now how it's eroding away because it's exposed. So this is something that we looked at across all the different sites. And just give you one example here. This is Newlyn, and all the information was pulled together and put into a database, and that's put into the Maritime Atlas and presented spatially on a map and chart, which is actually transgressed into the visualization tool, which you saw on Tuesday in more detail. So this just gives you an idea of some of the sources of material, what's to do with things by itself. Some of the databases, the heritage archives that we looked at, that the team all looked at, and the various publications. So we trawled through as much information as we could with all the data sources, and I suppose that's what we should do because we're archaeologists, we can find those data sources, pulled all the information out, and then scored every site with, say, we turn the sort of 9 or 8 or 7 into a percentage. We've scored every site, and we've tabulated it all within the big database in the Maritime Atlas, and these are just sections from the Maritime Atlas. But just as looking at Newtown, you've got the prehistoric submarine landscape, which is the old forest, and of course that seemed to get the highest score because it had that same issues of continuity and information that can help us understand the past. We also looked at art, as I mentioned, and with art again, we've defined certain characteristics, certain artistic styles, which is the most advantageous medium, the value of the subject matter, and the value of the time period, to try and break down these describers that would help us understand the significance and value of art in the sort of coastal change context. And here I've got the Crowstone, which is in Southend-on-Sea, dates back, the position of the Crowstone dates back to the sort of 13th century, about 1285, when it was first marked as a sort of the limit of the responsibility of the City of London for the navigation of the River Thames. And that Crowstone is still there today. We didn't see it. It was, we went past it the other day, but didn't actually stop and look at it. But it's still a marker, so it's a fixed point in the landscape. So the art can tell us, well, when it comes to here, it's got the subject matter, it's got coastal views, but this art has got a fixed point in the landscape that we can relate to the position today and also to elements of the coastline. This is just an example, of course. There are many other sites, many other images. And on Tuesday, I finished with that church falling into the sea as a nice little marker. Know where it is, so you can work out the rate and the pace of coastal change and coastal erosion through time with these sort of markers. And another one, I showed you this earlier, but it's quite significant because it shows us landslip complex. We know back in 1870 there's landslips happening around this particular area. These are very useful because you can look, as I mentioned before, areas of site stability or areas of site movement when it comes to insurance and risk which can be incorporated into those sort of decision-making processes, and also where you might not want to build with your urban plans. Well, art is also very useful because it can be quite dramatic, and this art, again, this image of Lyceum, Flushing, is nice and detailed, give you a lot of information about the town, where buildings are, where the defences are, and where the coastline is. And these can be very valuable when you start comparing them with today. And of course, many images are just lovely, and they're worth looking at. And I didn't sort of go through the detail of some of the art descriptors, but one aspect is looking at the sort of the accuracy of the art itself. 10 minutes left, okay. The accuracy of the art itself and the detail within it. And there can also be artifacts, there can be ships or shipwrecks in relative places that can give you positions from that particular point to the land, etc. And what we found is when we've been doing this for about over 20 years now, when we're putting forward images of muddy bits of wood in the beach, as you've already seen, and underwater sites, which don't really inspire people too much. But if you start giving them images, giving them nice artistic paintings, works of art, they tend to respond much more positively. And you can engage people. And you can engage people, coastal managers, but you can also engage the public much more readily. So it's a very powerful tool, even if quite often the art, as you can see on the right here, doesn't really, it depicts a true event, but it might not be as true to life as potentially as happened at the time. That was the breaking of the dikes around Amsterdam. And yes, and so here, I say, looking at Lyceum, again, every piece of art is described and scored appropriately. So we can work out what significant pieces of art, archaeology, etc., we want to involve. The same applies to charts and maps, that we've identified specific characteristics within charts and maps, that we can look to see how accurate they are, when they were made, and what they really tell us about the landscape. So it's the accuracy is important. The geometric accuracy is how we can actually then find that map and how we can put it back onto one of the various different global coordinate systems, so we can really use it in detail. And that really applies to the chronometric accuracy as well, is how it's looking at features in the map and how they really relate to the features nowadays. So here we have Ostend, of course, and one thing that's quite obvious is you have, quite clear, that you have that foreshore which has now receded quite extensively, which marries up with a lot of the other evidence we've seen in more recent history. And the subject matter with the charts are very important. So here you've got the whole of Flanders. You can see the great dune system running down the coastline there, quite stable. This is before too much of this sort of hard infrastructure was put in place. And you get evidence of sandbanks, etc. So you can start understanding long-term patterns of coastal development and geomorphology. You can also compare them. So as we go through time, they tend to get more accurate. Well, it depends on the school of cartography or map making. They tend to be more accurate, and you can start sort of comparing them with each other to see where the changes happened, and with current maps. So here, what we have, I've overlaid a map from the 17th century on top of the current flood risk, map. Can you all hear me? It seems to go loud every now and again. On top of the flood risk map, and what you can pick out here is you can pick out where all the old channels are, like the Sfyn Estuary and all the old waterways, and then you can see where the polders have been put in place. And today, all that poldering are the locations where you've got the greatest risk of flood now. So these are stories that you can explain to the public. Say, we're not going to knock down any walls, although they did at the Sfyn Estuary, not going to knock the dikes down. But the reason these areas are going to be flooding or flooded, we have it in historical record. We can tell where the likely flood risk is greatest and why. And once you can explain that to people, they're more likely to come on your side. And everything is, again, rated, certain percentages depending on the scoring. Everything is rated and put inside the Maritime Atlas. And the final subject is photographic scoring, where we look at the purpose, the coastal view, the heritage view, and the quality of the images. So yeah, so if it's a nice, pretty touristy picture, it might not rate too highly. If it's a coastal view showing coastal features, of course, much more important, and heritage view even better. And I just show these photos again because they sum it up really well. You have got a bit of a not so much a photograph, but 1852. You got nice a watercolour of Leon Sea, which we all went to the other day, and then as you go through time, you can see those changes quite dramatically, and you can generally start understanding why the coast has changed, and therefore you can sort of mitigate against any future threats and changes because you understand what's happened in the past. You can make better decisions about the future. And then somewhere like Mariagegi, excuse me for pronouncing it incorrectly, but by Ostend, you can look at the sea levels back at the turn of the 19 sort of 10s compared with today, and you have those nice big sea walls there, but then the beach, as we discussed on Tuesday, was pretty much ripped away because you upset the link, the adaptability of it, until modern times, of course. Now it's been backfilled again. The beach has been built up, which is actually giving more protection to the buildings behind, because the beach soaks up the water energy. So you can see, looking back in sort of 1910, 1920, why those storms had such a big impact, because the quality, the thick depth of the water hitting the grey infrastructure was much larger than it is today. So all that material, I say, all the evidence goes into our Maritime Atlas, where all these great big databases and scored information behind it. So it's not just a case of pretty pictures. We do look at it all fairly scientifically, and not that you need to read this, but this is just showing you examples of what's within the database. And that database, of course, is accessible to anyone that wants to look at it, and it has images behind it as well. But really, we've moved on from that, and we've moved on to the visualization tool. So that's information that you can access through the visualization tool. So you don't necessarily need to, unless you really want a detailed study, at the Maritime Atlas. So you can go straight to the visualization tool, as was described on Tuesday, go to the various sites and to look at the all the different records, and you can see what the most significant sites are, and generally what story they tell us about the changing coastline and what we can do next. I'm going to finish with our spatial planning decision-making model that's just been finalised, which I think will be discussed further by Franje and the team, been finalised by Jonathan, just turned up on Tuesday. Jonathan, who's not here today, unfortunately, but what it does show you from a longue durée perspective, that it's now been incorporated within this decision-making model right through it. You can't really read it, just trust me, but it's right at the beginning. You got in the initiation, you got to create the Maritime Atlas. In the master plan, you can look and understand, you can read those records to understand how the coastline has changed, as we've discussed. With the urban design, you can start introducing some of those lessons learned to the general public to help influence the design and think about working around heritage structures. And then during the construction, you have your database behind you of heritage sites, so you have all that information in place to work around it without damaging it. And you can also incorporate the heritage in your construction to enhance the urban design and the urban project to make it a better place for everyone. That built heritage, I think, is a very strong driver for giving people a sense of place and sense of belonging. And with that, I think my time for belonging is over, and I better sit down and we'll get back to my seat and leave the floor for the next speaker. Thank you.